Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you on the occasion of Darwin Day. Now, Darwin's life and work seem familiar to most of us, and that was, of course, also the case during his lifetime. Darwin's contemporaries had witnessed what they thought was an extraordinary revolution in science. After his voyage on the Beagle and many years of scientific labor, Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in 1859. And within about 20 years of that, after lots of debate and disputes, the international scientific community came to accept that evolution was a fact. This is something that most people today don't know, but yes, the debate over evolution was over in the scientific community way back then. And this conferred upon Darwin an almost saint-like status as a scientific figure. Well, not only that, but that and the many subsequent works that he published, many of which founded whole new disciplines and were extraordinarily innovative and surprising to his contemporaries, such as his discovery that insectivorous plants capture and actually digest insects in order to supplement for their poor soils to get more nutrients. But after Darwin died in 1882, people began to tell his story posthumously, and they have ever since. But what has happened, and perhaps this is inevitable, is that with the telling and retelling, year after year, decade after decade, sometimes little mistakes enter the story. It's a bit like mutations, I think, in the evolution of organisms. A little mistake arises, a little mutation, and it just carries on. And these accumulate and pile up, so that the story that most of us have heard about Charles Darwin today is very far from that known by Darwin himself and people who knew him. So let me take you through some of the principal things that have changed in the story of Charles Darwin. Let's start first of all with what was understood before him, before Darwin published his theory of evolution. Nowadays, most people seem to think that Darwin was publishing his theory of evolution in the face of a world that was, in modern parlance, creationist or young earth creationist even. In other words, people nowadays believe that just before Darwin, the scientific community and everyone else thought that the world was about 6,000 years old and that all the species on it had been created at once. That's not true. In fact, it couldn't be farther from the truth at all. So what you see on the slide here is a beautiful engraving from the Reverend William Buckland's Bridgewater Treatise on Geology. This was a lavish coffee table book for people with some money to spend, and it was an overview of the state of geology at that time. And back then, geology also encompassed paleontology. So in this huge fold-out diagram, Buckland is showing the different eras of rocks that have been identified so far, and above that are a large number of fossil species that have been found in the rocks. So remember, this is a reverend, this is a clergyman, and also a man of science. And he was one of the last holdouts to think that a global biblical flood was possible. By the time Darwin comes on the scene, no serious man of science believed that anymore. And this was not a traditional view that was overturned by non-believers. Absolutely not. Almost everyone in the scientific community back then was a pious Christian. But these particular people studied the earth and studied the rocks, and they became quite sophisticated in their studies. Here's an illustration, a popular engraving from 1849, which shows for a popular public audience the state of understanding about the history of the Earth in the decades before Darwin. What you see there is a chronological picture of the history of life on Earth, with the most primitive eras from the most ancient rocks at the bottom, with subsequent layers and subsequent fossil species later on, reptiles, and then in even more modern rocks they were found the fossils of mammals, but mammals of creatures that don't exist anymore, that were extinct. So first of all, extinction had to be accepted as a fact that had previously been considered to be very irreligious, to think that anything could have gone extinct. By Darwin's day, countless thousands of extinct species were known. But the point I'm making here is that what was also accepted was that life on Earth, in this ancient Earth, had appeared in a sequence. Again and again, in era after era after era, species were found in a fossil form, and in a subsequent era they were gone. But then there were other species, and that this sequence appeared to them to be progressive. In the oldest rocks were the most primitive and simplest living things. There were boneless fish, then there were bony fish, then there were reptiles, and there were amphibians, and there were mammals. And nowhere in that fossil record were there any human beings. Now, Darwin went to Christ's College, Cambridge, in 1828, and most books and websites and so on will tell you that Darwin went to Cambridge to study theology. Well, that's not true. There was no degree in theology. Yes, Darwin's father intended for him to become a clergyman, and by the way, his father was a non-believer, a freethinker. Nevertheless, that was a respectable profession for a young man of Darwin's social standing. The Darwins were a wealthy family. So Darwin's studies were identical to all the other students. He had to acquire a BA degree as a prerequisite to later undertake divinity training that he never undertook, because of course the voyage of the Beagle happened instead. And this was, as Darwin later said, was the principal shaping event in his life. However, nowadays, most sources on Darwin that tell you his life story will say that Darwin was not the official naturalist on board the Beagle, but in fact the captain's companion. This view arose only in recent decades, and it turns out not to be true. He was actually the official naturalist. It's often claimed that the ship's surgeon back then was, by default, always the ship's naturalist. That is actually not true. These stories are repeated without being checked with the original sources. So no, the surgeon was not by default the naturalist. So there you can see in Fitzroy's own book, Darwin is listed as though the extras on board, that is, those were not members of the Royal Navy, Charles Darwin, naturalist. And when Darwin returned, in the preface to his zoology of the voyage of the Beagle, thanked the authorities involved, through whom my appointment received the sanction of the Admiralty. My appointment as naturalist. Similarly, almost all of us believe, or have believed for a long time, that when Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands, some sort of eureka moment happened and he began to believe in evolution, or he discovered evolution in the Galapagos Islands. That also is not true. And historians have known this since 1982. But there's a more specific version of this story, and everyone has heard this. And this is still in virtually every biology textbook in the world, which is that the finches on the Galapagos Islands, now known as Darwin's finches, were the key, because Darwin observed their differently shaped beaks. Well, he did indeed observe their differently shaped beaks. However, he had no idea that they were adapted to different ecological niches, which is the lesson that biology textbooks want to teach. It's a great lesson, and the finches are a great example of it, but that is not an idea that comes from Darwin. He didn't know that. That's the work of later scientists. These finches, Darwin's finches, have become so iconic that they appear absolutely everywhere. And in perhaps the most extreme version of where they appear is on people's bodies. Yes, Darwin's finches have been emblazoned on many people. Now, after the voyage of the Beagle, when Darwin returned home and began to work on all the materials he collected, a few years later, in 1839, he married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. The Darwins settled in a sleepy little village just south of London called Down, and in a house called Down House. And here it is in a family photograph. Now, Darwin has already started to come up with his theory of evolution, and this is perhaps the greatest change in the way Darwin's story is told in modern times as compared to how it was when he was alive and for many decades after his death. And that is that Darwin delayed, that he held back his theory for 20 years. Now, Darwin himself never said this. No one who knew him ever said this. But since the 1960s or so, it has become the predominant theme in telling the story of Charles Darwin. So, for example, in 2009, in the exhibition at the American Museum of Natural History, this is the website for that exhibition, of all the things you could say about Charles Darwin, they chose, I've underlined it in red, for 21 years he kept his theory secret. Well, it's certainly dramatic and eye-catching. Almost as eye-catching as this. This is the website of the Natural History Museum in London. Their poster included this photograph of Darwin without any text about keeping it a secret, because the organizers knew that the public, that the audience, already know that Darwin kept his theory a secret. So they found a catchy way to visualize that Darwin is, shh, don't tell anybody, I've got this top secret theory of evolution. Sadly, this image has become one of the most popular photographs of Charles Darwin in the world today. But it's fake. This is a photoshopped hand on Darwin's face. And it's, unfortunately, most people don't know that. So you will see this absolutely everywhere. It's on murals, it's on mugs, it's on t-shirts, and once again, it's on people. Yes. Unfortunately, these people have had a fake photoshopped Darwin tattooed onto their bodies. Darwin never did this. But more importantly than that, this is something that Darwin didn't do. This, by the way, is the original photograph by Elliot and Fry from about the year 1880. Darwin himself said explicitly in the last edition of The Origin of Species that he didn't keep it a secret. By this last edition in 1872, Darwin was getting rather annoyed with people who claimed that, why do you act as if you were so original, as if you came up with this new way of looking at nature? Everybody believes in evolution. Darwin wanted to set this right and say, well, wait, hang on. Remember back in the old days, before I published my Origin of Species, and this is what he writes. I formerly spoke to very many naturalists on the subject of evolution and never once met with any sympathetic agreement. I spoke to very many. That's not a secret. That's the exact opposite of a secret. However, once this belief that Darwin had held back his theory and kept it a secret, lots of theories and reasons were proposed for why he did so. And there are many. Here's just a few. This book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, was published in 1844, shortly after Darwin had written a lengthy, rough draft of his theory as it then seemed to him. And countless writers repeated as if it were simply a fact that Darwin saw the stormy, fiery reception that this anonymous evolutionary book received and thought he would receive the same. No, there is not a shred of evidence for this, despite the fact that it is always repeated as a fact. If one looks very carefully, you can see that the book came out after Darwin had put away his rough draft and moved on, as he had planned, to the other work on his desk. Darwin was already engaged in many long-term scientific publishing projects, and only between two of them had he written that long draft. And he intended, when all the work was done, to then move on to his theory of evolution, which is actually what he did. One of the other popular theories is that Darwin was afraid of offending his religious wife and therefore didn't publish his theory of evolution. This also is simply made up. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. In fact, Emma Darwin actually edited both that early sketch in 1844 and the proofs of the origin of species in 1859. It's completely made up reason. It sounds completely plausible, and so it is repeated again and again and again as if it were simply a fact. It is not. It's completely false. So Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859 with the full awareness of his family, his neighbors, his friends, and the debates began. And of course, the rest is history. Now, there's another thing that is widely repeated about Darwin, perhaps as common as anything else. Namely, that Darwin was afraid that because he married his first cousin, that this was a union to consanguineous, that his children would suffer from this close union and were sickly and weak. And many of the Darwin children were sickly and weak. However, despite the fact that this claim is made everywhere, that Darwin was very worried about this, it is once again completely false. 100% false. Darwin, in fact, if you look at all the quotations that are actually used to support this, they actually say that Darwin was worried that his children had inherited his bad health. He never thought that their ill health was the result of marrying his first cousin. Here it is in the words of his eldest son. Darwin felt very deeply the chance there was of his weak constitution being inherited by his children. Yes. And perhaps even more popular than this view is, of course, his darling, beloved daughter, Annie, who died tragically of an illness in 1850. Now, virtually every source will tell you that her death ripped up the final shreds of Darwin's faith in Christianity. It's a compelling story, but it's also not true. Annie's death happened long after Darwin had given up his faith. In fact, we know from notes that he wrote at the time and from his recollections in later years that Darwin thought a lot about religion in the couple of years after he came back from the voyage of the Beagle. He was doing a lot of big thinking then. He was thinking about the nature of life, the history of life on Earth, and he also thought about the evidence for his religion. And as he says in his autobiography, and I urge you to reread it, it's a very short section on his religious belief, he lists his reasons very clearly why he gave up his belief. And they're all about evidence. And he says that he very gradually, slowly and gradually, gave up his faith. And that this process happened without distress. But the death of his daughter, his favorite daughter Annie, was the most distressing moment in Darwin's life. And it happened after he had lost his faith. What about this element of the Darwin story? The Darwin story is never complete without a mention of Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. And Huxley, a zoologist, was of course the great defender of Darwin. Fiery orator, with a wicked, razor-sharp pen. But despite the fact that literally tens of thousands of books and articles and documentaries tell us that Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog because of his tenacious defense of Darwin and Darwinism, they're all wrong. In fact, Huxley was never known as Darwin's bulldog, even though we all think he was. But we think so because of repetition in the later writings, modern writings. In fact, the phrase Darwin's bulldog first appears in print in a speech on the occasion of Huxley's death. It is a recollection which supposedly Huxley once used this phrase 20 years before, if you can trust the recollection of someone. And historians know that recollections are extremely untrustworthy, so we need to be careful with them. But what is not open to dispute is that during the debates over Darwinism, during Huxley's lifetime, he was never, ever called Darwin's bulldog. Now that's dramatically different than what we always hear, which just goes to show that we have to be careful about repeating traditional stories. And I think people interested in Darwin should not be averse to that kind of thinking, that we shouldn't repeat traditional stories simply because that's the way they were told to us and that's what we've always read, but we should be prepared to go back to the original evidence and check and see what was said. Another widespread myth is that Darwin converted to Christianity or denounced his theory of evolution on his deathbed. Well, we know this is nonsense and it is a complete fabrication. And those who like to repeat these stories are those who don't like his theory of evolution. But it really is something they should not waste their time on, because this is an appeal to authority. If the great Darwin went back to Christianity, well, then it must be true, or he must have been wrong before. And if he denounced his theory of evolution, well, we can toss it out. That's not how science works. It's not about authority. Even if Darwin had done any of these things, it wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't change his discoveries. It wouldn't change what all the international scientific community, even by that time, had verified umpteen number of times and was understood in great depth. That's not a mistake of an old man that can be taken back. Oops, sorry, didn't mean that. Didn't happen, no. And when Darwin died in 1882, he was, without doubt, the most famous man of science in the world. And he was respected, apparently, in every nation. One sees this in the eruption of obituaries that appeared. On the Darwin Online project, we've been collecting these for many years. We're nowhere close to finding out how many there were and in how many languages. But they are remarkably consistent in the way they told his story, his life story. Interestingly, from our perspective, is that when they tell the story of Darwin's life, the Galapagos are very often not mentioned at all, or just get a passing reference. Now, fast forward to today, when if you read an encyclopedia entry on Darwin or a brief account of him, the Galapagos will play a major part of the story. Why this change? Why this difference? That's something worth looking into. But all of these obituaries, written in all these countries and all these languages, but all these people, are remarkably consistent in the respect they paid to this man who had thought outside the box so profoundly that he had seen things that no one else had seen, that he had seen what others had overlooked for so long, and that he had put the pieces of the puzzle of nature together in a way that others simply had not imagined and had not imagined was possible. They all regarded him as the greatest revolutionary in science of their time, and some said perhaps of all time. This is the regard in which he was held by his contemporaries, and it was universal. It was quite astonishing. Now, modern people nowadays often have the image that Darwin's theory of evolution has been controversial ever since it was first published. This also is not true. As I said before, Darwin's theory of evolution was completely victorious by the 1870s. So what we witness in the world today with those who oppose evolution is a new movement that arose in the early part of the 20th century. And the new movements which are usually called creationism or something like that. So it's not always been the case that Darwin's theories have been disputed or debated like that. Now I'm going to move on to talk about his legacy and how Darwin has been commemorated ever since. And there's no better place to start than with the work of the zoologist, bibliographer, and historian R.B. Freeman, who died in 1986. Freeman was a scholar of prodigious abilities and achieved monumental works of scholarship on Darwin. And one of the things we can do with the benefit of the work that Freeman laid the groundwork for is to see just how widely Darwin has been influential in so many areas of human life, not just in evolutionary biology or the life sciences in general, paleontology and so on, but much, much further afield. So Freeman published first in 1966 and then a second edition in 1977, the works of Charles Darwin, an annotated bibliographical hand list, essentially a bibliography of the works of Charles Darwin. And it is a work that is still cited and respected today. And on the Darwin Online project, we've continued his work by incorporating it into an online database to which we have been correcting and adding for over a decade. And so his work continues to grow. All of which shows that the number of publications of Darwin's writing, of Darwin's words, exceed those of any other man of science who has ever lived, in terms of the number of editions, the number of translations, and so on. Now, Freeman also published this book, Charles Darwin, A Companion, in 1978. And as the dust jacket of the book reads, "This companion is the first of its kind to draw together the widely scattered facts about Charles Darwin's life and works. It is based on many years of reading and research. The material is arranged in a single alphabetical list of entries with full coverage of Darwin's career, his friends, family, scientific colleagues and opponents, his travels, writings, the flora and fauna associated with his name, and a host of other topics." Indeed. And this work, Companion we call it for short, is still cited by scholars today. It had about 3,000 entries and covered a wider range of topics than any work on Darwin, and indeed probably on most other historical figures would not have such a wide-ranging survey. And the reason for this, or what makes this possible and also important, is that the literature on Charles Darwin is so immense and so vast because he has been studied so much, and because we have such a large corpus of material, that Darwin wrote so much, and we have so many of his papers and notebooks and letters, and also those of his contemporaries, and that his effects were so disproportionate for a single man. This means that Darwin studies or Darwin scholarship is a very large area that no one could possibly survey themselves. So for anyone starting out in the field, it's extremely difficult. And Freeman's book was a very important way to find out just what exists and what is known. Now, the Charles Darwin Trust and particularly Randall Keynes, a descendant of Darwin, purchased the copyright of Freeman's bibliography and companion after his death. And they very kindly gave permission for the Darwin Online project to republish the bibliography and companion. And they also provided us with Freeman's own corrections and compilations of notes and so on, which he had intended for future editions. And here are some of them. Now these were used to create an online second edition of Freeman's Companion, which incorporated his corrections, and we made a few other additions and corrections ourselves. Now that second online edition went on Darwin Online in 2007, as well as the first edition. So one could always consult the original. That's what Darwin Online is all about. Those two editions that have been online since 2007 have been visited more than 500,000 times. Clearly, this was an extremely important book and has a lot of material that is unique, that readers cannot find anywhere else. Well, during the Darwin Bicentenary in 2009, everyone was busy giving talks. I think I gave about 50 public lectures around the world, and I published 4 books on that occasion. Many Darwin scholars published a lot. It was a very hectic year. But during that year, during one of the Darwin conferences, I was approached by this man, Paul van Helvert, Dutch scholar with a very profound knowledge of Darwin studies and Darwin's publications in particular. And he approached me with an idea. How about revising Freeman's Companion completely from the ground up and making as if it were to be done today, with the advantage of all of the discoveries that scholars have made in the intervening years, all of the things that have turned up, with the advantage of the internet and so on, things that Freeman didn't have in the 1970s. And so we started what turned out to be a project that took us over 10 years. Starting and stopping, of course, not continuously. I certainly did many projects in between. And sometimes, I have to confess, my interest began to lag a little bit as I was drawn to one book project or another. But then, not long ago, we were joined by this lady, Christine Chua, a associate editor volunteer for the Darwin Online project, who began to take a very great interest in this new companion. And it was through her enthusiasm and boundless energy that I myself found a renewed interest in pouring my own energies and enthusiasm back into companion. And we worked on it with a renewed vigor and energy. And the new companion that has resulted is very much improved and greater and more extensive and more accurate because of Christine's assistance. And for that, we will always be in her debt, as will our readers. And so, after over a decade of work and consulting well over 1 million sources in well over a dozen languages, we have brought out a new companion. And we've called it Darwin, a Companion. This is the cover. Now we'll just survey some of the things that this companion reveals, because amongst many other things, and what I'm about to say is not the focus or the intent of the book, but one of the things that the book shows is that Charles Darwin has been, not only scientifically, but also culturally, socially, artistically more influential and more commemorated than any scientist who has ever lived. And I will demonstrate that shortly. By the way, I'll just say about the cover, one of the things, of course, we wanted to do in Companion was to share with our readers as many things that were new discoveries that we had made or that others had made, so that they would find out new things about Darwin, see new things. And that's right here with the cover. This photograph has never been published before. On the back cover is a painting of Darwin's new study at Down House as it was left after his death, painted by his niece. This has never been published before. Now, let me just give you a summary. Our Companion, which, by the way, I'll just say, has just come out this week. It's now in the flesh, which I have to say is very satisfying after staring at it as a screen for so long. So it has about 7,000 entries on Darwin's family, servants, friends, opponents, publications, manuscripts, his finances, his personal library, and a host of other topics. We've discovered that 29 books were dedicated to Darwin, not 7, as we used to think. That 92 scientific societies elected him a member during his lifetime. And that since then, at least 247 stamps, banknotes, and coins depict him. And 70 institutions in 92 streets, buildings, ships, and many other things. And 130 monuments are named after him. His works have been translated into 64 languages. Freeman knew of 33, which makes Darwin by far the most widely translated scientist in history. And his name has been given to species of living things 700 times. Again, a record. Darwin is famously referred to always as a recluse, but we have compiled a list of over 400 visitors, and that's excluding family and neighbors. Not such a recluse after all, perhaps. We have provided an itinerary showing where he was on all the occasions that we found evidence for, when he went up to London, when he was on holiday here or there, and so on, throughout the Beagle voyage, day by day. So 730 entries will allow readers to look up, where was Darwin during this time? Could he have met the person I'm writing about? This is where you can look it up. And then the part of the book that I devoted myself to, and which I had actually begun before this companion project began, which is iconographies, which is portraits, a list of portraits or portrayals. Well, Freeman had already provided a small iconography in his companion of 55 portraits of Darwin in oils, watercolors, drawings, prints, and photographs. So I decided, rather than doing a separate book, I should put all of that I had found and would continue to find into this companion, where in the place where Freeman had originally had his list of 55. But I didn't stop there. I also did an iconography of the Beagle, although I included only the depictions that were by eyewitnesses or those who had actually seen the ship. And I found 56, including some that were not previously known. Also one of Down House and its grounds, and also of Emma Darwin, his wife. But of Darwin himself, there are over 1,000 unique portraits. I do not count the same thing copied over and over, only unique works. So in 3 dimensions, that's statues, busts, medallions, and so forth, there have been 240 depicting Darwin. Oil paintings, and that's only counting until the year 2009, there have been at least 71 that I've located. Watercolors, drawings, and stained glass windows, I found 142 of those. And prints, so any printed form of portrait of Darwin, again only unique ones, and I stopped in the year 1982 to make it even remotely manageable because there were so many. I found about 600 unique depictions of Darwin. And some of them are very interesting and some of them are very amusing. So I've provided you a second slide just to share some of these, because almost all of these have never been seen before. They were not known before, they were not recorded. But perhaps the part I find the most interesting are the photographs. This is the largest list of photographs of Darwin ever published. At least, and probably a bit more than 50 photographs are now known of. And I discovered 7 that were previously unknown. But usually in books you will see the same photographs again and again, and many mistakes have been made about them, about who the photographer was, their dates, and so on. All of these have been exhaustively researched. In addition, this new companion gives a complete catalogue of all of the variants of those photographs, because there wasn't just a photograph made, but they were printed again and again over time, and it's often possible to work out when a particular version was printed, and some of them were reprinted extremely widely, others never. So 300 printed variants of Darwin photographs have been identified, and that's only counting up to, say, 1910 or 1915 or so. And then, of course, there are the caricatures of Darwin. Everyone knows those. 53 have been found from the 19th century, including some that have not been seen before. And they're great fun. Darwin himself enjoyed them very much. He had a large collection. He thought they were funny. So, in conclusion, I can honestly say that never before has a book revealed so much new information about Charles Darwin and his unparalleled worldwide influence. And so I invite you to dive in and explore and see just how much has been written and made with reference to Charles Darwin, and we can only imagine that such things will continue. Thank you very much.